Welcome, and Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
And into the Torah portion for this week. And all right, here we go. So again, this is all having to do with that very first Pesach and the various halachot involved in that. So, and we're analyzing them, and that is the hallmark, in fact, or one of the hallmarks of Judaism, is to see just the notion that we have these commandments, that God has shared these commandments, has revealed his will to us, and that we, on our part, want to show our love. It gives us a way in which to show our love. I love to refer to a Bangles song from quite a few years ago, where it talks about the frustration, the fact that he wants to give it. If he knew what she wanted, he'd be giving it to her, but she doesn't know what she wants, and how frustrating that is for him in that particular song. So here is this act of love that we see, that this is part of an expression of divine love, that God has revealed this his will through the Torah, and that on our part, this incredible effort over the centuries to carefully analyze the details of this written document that we have, and to try and find ways in which to implement it into our lives, and the various situations, etc. And I love to show that even in this particular commandment, there's an example of what we would call oral Torah, that the nature of oral Torah is to take this written Torah and apply it, to actually find ways to apply it into our lives. So Rashi's giving us a little taste of this. I mean, this is essentially what the Talmud is doing in analyzing so carefully and trying to pull apart. And of course, it doesn't end at the Talmud stage. It goes beyond that too. So, Uvayom Harishon, and on the first day, Mikra Kodesh, it is a sacred convocation, right? Kara is to call out, so a sacred convocation, I think, is a lovely translation of that. Uvayom Hashvi'i, and the seventh day, Mikra Kodesh, I believe it's going to say, Yelachem, it shall be for you. So there are people who know that the first day of Pesach, or rabbinically the first 2 days of Pesach, are Yom Tovim. They are Yom Tov, they're festival days, and certain labors are forbidden, just like on Shabbat on those days. A lot of people don't know that the seventh, and in the case of rabbinically, the 8th day outside the land of Israel, are also Yom Tov, based on what we just read here. And look at how he's going to say, Kol melacha lo ye'aseh vahem. No work should be done on them. Now here's this incredible, right here we see there's one exception. However, asher ye'achel l'chol nefesh, that which a person needs to eat, right? So this is where we get the halacha that you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, which you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. You can't do cooking on Shabbat, but here we have the idea that cooking for the sake of a meal that you're going to eat. So again, analyzing this carefully, let me finish the sentence, forgive me, right? That which a person will eat, right? Every person shall eat, or any person shall eat. Hu levado, it by itself, that by itself, ya'aseh lachem, can be done for you. So the issue, and again, in terms of trying to understand all the implications of this particular line. So if you need to cook a meal that you will consume on Yom Tov, right? Just following so carefully what this just said, it's okay to do that. But if you want to cook on Yom Tov for another day, that is not permissible. So I can't, if I have something that is not on Yom Tov, and I want to cook something for that particular day, I can't do it. But then there are situations that come up where you need to be able to do it. So, for example, if Shabbat follows a Yom Tov, when you can't do it at all, and then there are ways in which to be able to deal with that situation. But all trying to look at not only the letter, but the spirit of the law as well.
But also, I wanted to mention that cooking, you can cook, but you can't light a fire or, ignite a gas stove.
Right. So that is a rabbinic prohibition. Okay. Yes, it's true. And of course, in days you can, however, you can light a fire from an existing fire. So
Yeah,
of
that's
course,
true.
when there were pilot lights, they were the perfect Yom Tov stove, when the perfect Yom Tov oven, when pilot lights were still in existence, because to take a light from a fire from an existing fire is okay to do, and which you can't do on Shabbat, by the way. You can't do that on Shabbat. So what they would do is they would light a candle before, a flame before the Yom Tov, and they would use that flame to light the stove or to light another candle or anything like that. But that needs to be done before Yom Tov starts. Right. But again, if you're just coming to this kind of stuff, that may be overly restrictive. And again, you want to, on a practical level, start at a point where you can live with it. And then in the hopes that as you get used to this way of living, you will start to include some of these particular restrictions as well. So again, just trying to bring the Torah down from heaven onto earth. And these are all things that one has to take into consideration. So Rashi, Mikra Kodesh, right? A sacred convocation. Mikra, Shem Davar, right? So the word Mikra, he says, is a noun. Kra oto Kodesh, you shall declare it holy, sanctified. In other words, sui generis, unique, that you have to treat this day differently that you might other days. Kodesh la'achila ushtiya ukasut is the word here. In other words, that you should have a food, drink, and clothing. That declaring this day special is understood to be done through the food, the unique food that you eat, special food, the drink that you have, and that you wear different clothes on this particular day, all by way of showing and expressing the sanctity of the day. Lo ye'aseh bahem, it shall not be done on these days. And here it says, so the fact that it says it shall not be done, as opposed to you shall not do, means afilu al yedei acherim, that is, even at the hands of other people. In other words, there might be, and I think, as I would understand Rashi, it's saying even someone who may not be commanded to observe the Yom Tov, such as a non-Jew, it sounds like here these melachot cannot be done by a non-Jew. Now, I'm not sure exactly how the oral Torah, how the development of this understands it. In generally speaking, there's a principle that if you're not allowed to do something, you can't ask someone else to do it for you if there's a prohibition. But the wrinkle is that non-Jews are not commanded to observe these things. In other words, that is part of the very definition of choosing not to be Jewish, is not accepting these particular restrictions. So that if the non-Jewish person is doing it for themselves and then coincidentally doing it for a Jewish person, that is a different situation. And there's an understanding, and I realize this is where you start to get the sense of splitting hairs and where people start to lose patience with us. But the truth again is that ask yourself, when do you split hairs? Generally when you're obsessed over something. And obsession and love are very closely allied. So that if you really are in love with God and in love with the law and the revealed and seeing it as divinely revealed will, then these particular issues of hair splitting become important. So there's a chapter in Tractate Shabbat which discusses work done for a Jew by a non-Jew, and they give some very interesting examples. I'll give you one. So, for example, if a shepherd fills a watering trough to water his sheep, you can water your sheep at the water of that trough. But if he's doing it for you, you can't do it. There are also issues as to whether or not you're friends with the person and to what degree. In other words, this is getting into the spirit of the law and to the extent that he is doing it. So again, if somebody's doing it for a salary, if there's an agreement that this person is going to be paid for what they're doing for you, then it can be seen as them doing it for themselves in the assumption that they wouldn't be doing it if you weren't paying them. So all these kinds of issues then become germane to analyzing what it means by shall not be done. Hu lavado, so that alone, right? This is referring to cooking. Yachol af lakna'anim, so this is interesting, okay? So I think what he's saying is that maybe it's saying that you can cook for non-Jews, and that's what they mean by kna'anim. But kna'anim again would be, literally it means Canaanites. So are we talking about idolaters? Is that the issue that's important? Because there is a term, Eino Yehudi, which would mean a non-Jew. So Talmud lomar hu levado ye'aseh lachem. So here we go. So he alone shall it be done for you. Lachem. So that's why this lachem is there for you. Lachem velo likna'anim. So in other words, it is done for fellow Jews and not for Canaanites. So how broadly does the Torah understand the term Israelite? Right? It doesn't have in some ways the formal meaning that it does nowadays, but rather might well refer to someone who believes in God, right? Understands as a unique and singular origin, excuse me, of the universe and creator. Hu velo machshirav. So again, this hu levado, meaning here in this case the hu meaning it alone, right? It alone, and so the hu is referring to cooking. So the hu levado, it alone shall be done for you. So there the for you is and not for Canaanites. Hu, it, velo machshirav, this is what Lauren was referring to, and not other things that make it possible. Right? To machshir means that in this case are things that make something else possible. She'efshar la'asotan me'erev Yom Tov, which could be done on the eve of the festival. And that's exactly the lighting the fire, right, for cooking. So lighting a fire alone isn't cooking. However, you may need to light a fire in order to cook. But if you can light the fire before Yom Tov, you can do it. And this is in the line of hu velo machshirav. So the question I would have right now is, I was saying that's a rabbinic stricture. Based on this particular interpretation, one might argue that in fact this is biblical, that it has the strength of a Torah law, and it's not a protective law. So just again, things to think about. L'chol nefesh, for every soul, for every individual. Afilu lebehema. So interesting that because it says nefesh, it's talking about living creature, and understanding that to include a cattle as well. Okay, yachol. So you can do that. You can prepare food. You can cook. If you need to cook food for your animals, you can do it on Yom Tov, right? Af l'kna'anim, right? Yachol af l'kna'anim. So back into this, and by the way, we notice that the previous, I want to show you this, right? Notice that this was in parentheses, And that's possible that they're saying that this was added later. This is not really part of the Rashi, original Rashi. And the fact that what we have here, that we're bringing up this subject again regarding Canaanites, and here it makes a lot of sense in this particular passage, right? And it's not in parentheses, is because the previous reference to Canaanites is not really part of that original text. At any rate, here it's saying, so since it says that we're allowing animals as well, maybe we should allow Canaanites as well. Talmud lomar lachem. And that's why it says, for you. And for you means because these Canaanites are not your property, and the cattle are your property. So it says nusach acher. There's another version of this that says ach being a restrictive clause. And so the idea that when it says, let's take here, it says ach hu levado, I believe. Right, let's see. Here, ach asher yachel. This word ach is understood to restrict it to yourself and your cattle. In other words, it's something that is your property as well, which is why animals are included. Yes, David.
So, okay, I've always been curious about this particular portion, especially when you go into the the workarounds like the pilot light and the candle,
Yes.
those kinds of aspects. So I guess when we talk about the spirit of this, originally, I mean, they didn't have stoves with pilot lights, right? They might not have thought, so to use the candle, to transfer the fire over so that they could cook on, on this day. So in the original intent, what was really the original intent around, around them not being able to do that? What would they have done if they didn't have these workarounds? Was it,
Okay.
So
They would have had a workaround of some kind. If they didn't have the workaround, remember it says, if you can do it Erev Yom Tov. If they didn't have a workaround, then you would not be able to do it Erev Yom Tov, and you'd have to do it on Yom Tov. At least that's the way we can understand the wording, if we look carefully at the wording of what Rashi said. However, they've had lamps, the idea of oil lamps, for a long, long time. Yes, I see two of you have raised your hands. So I have Lauren's name and whoever else raised your hand. Go ahead. So who else?
The other one's David.
Okay, all right. So Lauren.
yeah, I'll take mine down. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just curious in terms of transferring flame to cook, and I usually use like a yahrzeit candle, or you can get a big candle, and you might have to do it twice if you use a yahrzeit candle.
Yes.
But I was curious, can you build a fire before Shabbos and enjoy the fire by just transferring flame and adding a log to it?
No, you can't add flame on Shabbat.
That's not, it's transferring flame.
I know, but when you're transferring flame, you're in a sense also adding flame. In other words,
because it's
creating another flame from the flame you have.
right. But if you transfer one candle to another candle or to a stove, you are also doing that.
But you're igniting it. Yeah, but you're allowed to add flame on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, forgive me. You're allowed to add flame on Yom Tov precisely because that's involved in the cooking, right? But there's a difference between adding, so we do make a distinction between adding and igniting, all right? So while you cannot initially ignite a flame on Yom Tov, if you can do it before Yom Tov, you are allowed to ignite another candle from an existing flame, right? You just can't initiate it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So like,
you can't do that on Shabbat.
If I'm going to light Yom Tov candles, for instance, for the second night,
yes,
I'm going to take that yahrzeit candle
yes,
and use that to light the candles with and just transfer the flame.
Correct.
And if I built a fire before Yom Tov,
yes,
that's the flame. That's the initiated flame.
That's fine. Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Adding a log to it isn't.
Right, that's fine. Again, that's okay on Yom Tov. I thought you were saying on Shabbat. Forgive me.
I might have accidentally said Shabbat, but I meant Yom Tov.
No, this would all be okay. If
Yeah.
you're absolutely allowed to add, you can add fuel, you can do whatever you like as long as the flame is pre-existing, right? However, on
Yeah.
Shabbat, you're not allowed to do that. So
Right. Right.
you can't even add oil to a, say, an oil lamp so that it burns longer on Shabbat. You can't do that.
Well,
In fact,
fortunately, Shabbat's only one evening.
yes, of course,
Like
yes.
you can light the candles before Shabbat and then after the Havdalah, but you
I
don't
mean,
need to.
yes, of course, but you can again, you can take that pre-existing candle, you can light a match from that pre-existing flame and use that match then to light something else. There'd be no
On on Yom Tov.
on Yom Tov, not on Shabbat. You can't mess around with flame on Shabbat at all. Can't mess around with it. That's why there is a concept of not even touching candlesticks. That's a whole other subject, big subject,
Muktzah.
exactly, called muktzah, right? The word muktzah means set aside. In other words, something you would not have anything to do with on Shabbat. It's set aside from Shabbat. Yes, David, you still had a question?
Trying to get off mute. Yeah. So basically, then, just to kind of make sure I got this, is that basically, no matter what, they would have come up with something Erev Yom Tov, right? Is what
Correct.
you're
Yes.
back regardless. And so it's kind of built in with the assumption that they would figure something out, which the path is somewhat obvious. Okay. So is that kind of the idea?
Yes,
Oh,
that is the idea. I mean, here's the point. Think about how essential to civilization the whole idea of fire was, right? I
yeah.
mean, fire was so basic, whether it was used for illumination or for cooking or for heating. I mean, fire is just a really fundamental kind of thing. And of course, we have oil lamps going back for years and years and years. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course, of course. Okay, so going on, ushmartem, right? You shall guard. Excuse me. Oh, look at this. We have an entire page with it's all Torah Tmima, right? Et hamatzot, you shall guard the matzot, the unleavened cakes. Ki ve'etzem hayom hazeh, because in the midst of this day, right? Etzem atzum has to do with strong. So in other words, the strength of the day, right? Hotzeti et tzivotechem, I took out your hosts, me'eretz Mitzrayim, from the land of Egypt, ushmartem et hayom hazeh, and you shall guard this day, the dorotechem, for your generations, chukat ulam, as an everlasting law, we'll call it that, right? A chok, remember, generally has the meaning of a non-rational, in other words, something that's a commandment from the king, right? That you do it because the king told you to do it, right? It's an acknowledgement of divine sovereignty. And now, so we have moved, you notice, from the Pesach of Egypt and saying that it is a model for all future Psachim. And there's something, I think, quite beautiful in the notion that whenever we celebrate Pesach, even nowadays, right, we are hearkening back to that original Pesach. So, ushmartem, and you shall guard et hamatzot, the matzahs, shelo yavuu leidei chimutz, that they should not become leavened, right? So, mikan amru, let me look at this. Yeah, I think I'm looking to see whether this is titach hal teltosh name. So, I'm not sure exactly what this is referring to, but it says that you have to be so careful that the matzahs shouldn't get any leavening, despite the fact that they're unleavened. But it has to do, sonain is cold water, right? And I think this is, I'd have to look at let's see, all right. This could be hapat tiltosh betzonen. The print is so hard to read, but this would make sense saying, because tiltosh has to do with kneading, that when you knead this, it has to be kneaded in cold water, right? That you can't use any heat, any warm water when you prepare matzahs. So, because of the possibility that heat is going to it's going to accelerate the process of chimutz, of natural leavening. Rabbi Yoshaya or Yoshia Omer, right? Rabbi Josiah Omer says, Al tihi kore et hamatzot. Don't read this as matzot. Remember, look at how this is spelled. And there's a vav there, right? And he says, Ella et ha-mitzvot. But you should read this as if it's saying, you shall guard the mitzvot, the commandments. Kederech she'en machmitzim et ha-matzot. That just as, so in other words, and what's its connection to matzah? That just as you don't allow the matzahs to become leaven, right? To become sour, literally, right? So in other words, that you leave the water on them, and the time, again, it's not just heat, it's also time, right? That the process takes time. Kach ein machmitzim et hamitzvot. Likewise, you shouldn't allow mitzvahs to become sour, and we'll explain exactly what that means. Ella imba liadcha. But if you have an opportunity to perform a mitzvah, aseh ota miyad, you should do it immediately. Now we also know, so this is how he likes to explain and take this particular sentence, which admittedly is about matzot, and show that because it's spelled this way, right, it could be seen as mitzvot. You could point this word in such a way that it would read mitzvot. But he draws a wonderful, profound lesson from this. And what's profound about it is that when someone asks you to do something, delaying, putting it off and putting it off and putting it off is not the way you show love. On the other hand, alacrity and a desire to achieve it as soon as possible is also an expression of love. Ushmartem et hayom hazeh, right? And you shall guard this day mi malacha, from performing work on it. And again, this just shows you how nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. The Torah is sort of emphasizing this because it knows human nature, and it knows that it's so easy for people to want to do this, to want to work, to ignore the festival. And so that's why it emphasizes it like this. And I think this is where we will, no, okay, I want to try and finish this up, although this, yeah, okay, let's try. L'dorotechem chukat olam, right? For all your generations as an everlasting law. Lefi shelo ne'emar dorot v'chukat olam al hamelacha. And this is because, or since, the statement regarding generations and a law forever, an everlasting law, is not said about labor, ela al hachagiga, but regarding the celebration of the festival, lachach chazar ushenao kan. For this reason, this phrase is repeated here. In other words, initially we talked about this becoming an everlasting law, an everlasting observance. Remember, we had that analysis of Dorot as being just two, and that's why it has Olam, forever. So it said a second time here, Shelo tomar azharat kol malacha lo yaseh lo ledorot ne'emara. So it means in case, if it weren't repeated here, you might say, well, this law regarding labor, etc., that it shouldn't be done, wasn't in fact for all generations. It was just briefly, it was just for that time. So now it's said here, Ela lo oto hador, but just said for that particular generation. We can't say that anymore. That this particular statement makes it very clear that the idea of refraining from labor on Yom Tov is in perpetuity, that it is locked in to the observance of the holiday. And at this point, we will end the lesson. So let me mark this in here and here. And I'm going to stop the share and stop the recording.